Our final period is 1985 to 2020. We'll begin by examining the situation in 1985 in a few parts of the world with a focus on three statistics. In this kind of dot graph, we can actually, with one dot, capture three statistics. Let's take China as an example. In 1985, the population was a little over 1 billion. Income per person was quite low at around 2,600 US dollars, counting the purchasing power of a dollar in the US in 2011. Then the third thing, total carbon dioxide emissions. This is represented by the area of the China circle. The number is around 2 billion tons, but let's not worry too much about that. The important thing is that in 1985, China's emissions were smaller than those for Europe or the USA, and greater than those for Africa and India. By the way, these bubbles or dots don't cover the whole world. I wanted to focus on a few key countries and regions. We see that in 1985, emissions from Europe and the USA were quite high. Why? Not really because there were so many people in these places. The US had 238 million people at the time compared to China's 1 billion. But emissions were high in the USA and in Europe to a large extent because these parts of the world were quite rich and people could afford to have cars, travel around, heat fairly big houses and so on. We'll come back to this graph later and see where all those bubbles were 35 years later in 2020. But before we do that, we're going to look at what happened when it comes to, firstly, our knowledge about the effects of emissions, and secondly, the growth of international organizations and agreements aimed at limiting the harm of these emissions. For governments and other organizations to start taking action on climate change, there had to be enough knowledge about how the climate worked and how fast humans were changing the climate. Not everyone would agree that 1985 is when our knowledge became sufficiently clear, but roughly it was around here. Already in 1958, so before then, an American scientist called Charles Keeling started measuring carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere using instruments placed on top of a volcano in Hawaii. So since then, we have known that CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing fairly quickly. But we didn't know what the effect of this would be. Then, in 1979, this important report by a group of American scientists was released. It was just 22 pages long, but summarized and evaluated work various other scientists have been doing on a vital question. What was going to happen to the climate as a result of having more CO2 in the atmosphere? This report concluded that if we double the CO2 levels in the atmosphere or increase it by 100%, the average temperature of the air around us is most likely to increase by 3 degrees Celsius. This is a change which would influence many things, including rainfall and through melting ice, even sea level rises. Now, we haven't doubled CO2 levels yet, but by 2020, we had increased it by 45% since pre-industrial times. So we are around halfway to doubling it. This little 22-page report eventually led to the United Nations establishing a body in 1986, whose name soon became Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. The IPCC is today the most important body looking at climate change and involves thousands of scientists around the world. This is why I'm saying here that the knowledge about modern climate change became widely accepted in around 1985. So, we know about the problem. What do we do about it? In 1997, virtually all the national governments of the world met in Kyoto, Japan, and came up with an agreement called the Kyoto Protocol. According to this agreement, the countries of the world, which, to put it simply, had become rich thanks to industrialization and a lot of emissions, agreed that by 2012, their emissions would be no higher than what they had been emitting in 1990. The 36 rich countries signing the agreement can be seen here. One rich country is, of course, missing, the United States. The US government decided not to participate in the Kyoto Protocol because it was worried that the agreement would make it difficult to improve the average income of Americans even further. The US also used the argument that non-rich countries such as China, India, and Brazil should also agree to control their emissions in some way. The position of the United States was strongly criticized by most of the rest of the world, including other rich countries. Let's remember that the US was at the time still the world's biggest emitter. And perhaps the world was disappointed because so many of the top scientists who had helped us understand climate change were from the US. One last point. Canada was initially in, but then stepped out. Something that makes it easier for governments to ignore international agreements on climate change is what is called climate change denial. Though almost all scientists agree that emissions caused by humans have created the risk of very serious climate change, there are people who have argued against this, basically saying that climate change is not something we should worry too much about. Such messages are often popular, and it's easy to understand why. It's difficult for many people to accept that we have to spend money changing things now and perhaps consume less of certain things to make things easier for future generations. Okay, what happened to emissions following Kyoto? The CO2 picture looks like this. Here I'm using that pre-map HIS data I used previously. The original Kyoto targets were for 2012, but these were extended for a few more years. We can see that the 36 rich countries which did say they would try to reach targets, and let's remember that countries not reaching their targets could pay a fine. These countries did see emissions in 2019, which were about 20% lower than in 1990. For the United States, which did not agree to any targets, emissions went up a bit by 2%. And then we see that China and the rest of the world, which had not emitted so much in the past, were now emitting more and more as they industrialized and tried to catch up to rich countries in their level of development. For the world as a whole, annual CO2 emissions went up between 1990 and 2019 by a whole 66%. Three important things happened here when it comes to the numbers and knowledge we have on climate change. In 2001, the IPCC came up with a new report, 3,000 pages in all, if you include the appendices, where among other things they presented new analysis on how climate change could worsen poverty around the world if we didn't control things properly. The report made it clear that climate change was very likely to worsen poverty across the world. In 2006, the IPCC came up with a standard method for countries to calculate their annual emissions. This is not an easy task. There are no instruments that measure, say, how much carbon dioxide is coming out of a city every day from thousands of cars, factories, and so on. Instead, you have to take how much fuel is being purchased, how much steel, cement, and so on is being produced, and then calculate emissions from that. Today, almost all countries produce what are called greenhouse gas inventories, which are available on the website of this United Nations body. And then in 2011, more reliable historical emissions numbers became available based on work that looked at how industrialization happened in different countries across the world over the centuries. This is why we now have the data I looked at earlier in these videos of emissions going back to 1750. These historical emissions are not just important for understanding history, they are very important for calculating what are known as national carbon budgets. Different researchers have worked out how much each country can emit in total in the industrial era without causing too much climate change for the world. To put it very simply, a country's carbon budget is bigger if its population is larger. If you're a country such as Britain or the United States, you've actually already used up your budget. For instance, at the start of the Industrial Revolution, the USA's budget in what we can call the carbon bank was around 100 billion tons of CO2. But if you add up the CO2 emissions produced by the USA between 1750 and 2020, using our pre-map HIS data, we find that 417 billion tons have already been emitted. What does this mean? They've used up their credits. It means that the USA and other rich countries should stop emitting now absolutely soon as possible and have an important responsibility when it comes to assisting latecomers in the industrialization process to emit as little as possible through new technologies. If you're a country such as China, even if emissions may be high, you haven't used up all your budget yet, basically because you started the industrialization race quite late. You can imagine there's a lot of disagreement over how exactly to use national carbon budgets in the international negotiations and how to calculate these budgets. But they're a very important part of the current climate politics. Some have used the term atmospheric colonization. Countries like Britain colonized much of the world, but in a way they also colonized the atmosphere in the sense that they used up their own budget and then turned to using carbon budgets of other, mostly poorer countries. Among our last historical milestones is the 2015 Paris Agreement. This agreement replaces the Kyoto Protocol. Its main aim is to make sure that the average temperature of the air around us does not get more than 1.5 degrees Celsius hotter than it was when the Industrial Revolution began. This agreement is different from Kyoto in two important ways. First, it says all countries in the world should try to limit emissions, not just rich countries. Poorer countries should enjoy more flexibility because they've emitted less in the past, but they all need to have targets for limiting emissions. The second big difference is that the Paris Agreement doesn't have fines for countries that don't meet their targets. Instead, the idea is that there must be a lot of transparency and accountability. Basically, that means no one should hide their emissions, and countries that do not take their targets seriously should be exposed, basically shamed. Once again, the United States has not been willing to participate. While the Obama government of the USA did sign the Paris Agreement, the Trump government took the USA out of the agreement. We've looked at inequalities across countries. To end off this timeline, we'll go just a couple of years beyond 2020 to 2022. The 2022 World Inequality Report we've discussed previously came out with new and interesting information. Inequalities within countries when it comes to the carbon footprint. We've seen, for example, that emissions in the United States are high. But if you break that down by whose consumptions lie behind those emissions, then you find that the 10% of people with the largest carbon footprint are responsible for 71% of the country's emissions. This inequality is, of course, closely linked to income inequality. If income is concentrated among a few, then those few will also be able to consume a lot, which influences their carbon footprint in comparison to the rest of the country. According to the World Inequality Report, income inequality worsened after around 1980. Here we see how responsible the top 10% of emitters in several major countries are for all the country emissions. Here's the 71% for the United States we spoke about. South Africa has a long history of inequality, and China has become a lot more unequal as the country industrialized. This explains why these two countries are particularly unequal inside the country when it comes to the carbon footprint. That completes our timeline. Now, let's go back to our bubble graph, where previously we saw the situation for 1985, and let's add the bubbles for 2019. We've already seen that emissions went up a little in the United States. The size of the bubble got slightly larger. Europe, which participated in Kyoto, saw a bit of a decline in emissions. But let's remember that some of this is because things that used to be produced in Europe are now imported from places like China. But most of the increase in emissions during this 1985 to 2019 period was outside the USA and Europe. To what extent was this because populations increased, something which pushes up emissions, and to what extent was it because the average person had more income to use for consumption? For India and for China, the biggest factor pushing up emissions was income per person. Though Africa experienced some improvements in average income, here the biggest factor was actually pushing up emissions was population increase. We've reached the end of this series of videos. To end off, let's see a 2023 clip of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres.
Climate change is here, it is terrifying, and it is just the beginning. The heat is unbearable, and the level of fossil fuel profits and climate inaction is unacceptable. No more hesitancy, no more excuses, no more waiting for the others to move first. There is simply no more time for that. It is still possible to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius and avoid the very worst of climate change, but only with dramatic, immediate climate action.
Clearly, history is one way we can get to understand this problem better, so we can ask our leaders for the right things, become leaders ourselves, and take action individually wherever possible.